In light of the events of the last week in which Dr. Fauci testified before Congress and pled the case that he was a victim of scorn and ridicule for his simple act of being a magnanimous servant of the people, an idea has been formulating in my head about what has happened to our American institutions. In almost every case, we find ourselves untrusting of the government, healthcare, banking, and civic institutions. We have not been led here simply by our own skepticism or without cause. As the testimony in Congress demonstrated, it is apparent that the actions of our leaders, the bureaucrats that implement the policies, and the corporations that supply the funding are all elevating their own self-service over the service of others. Over and over, each of these once venerated institutions of the American life have undermined the generations of trust that have been earned. Everything, from media to medicine, has lost what was once the trust of the citizen. It is disheartening, but also has become the dividing point amongst the people of this great country. After all, if nothing can be trusted, everyone must be held in suspicion. People in power have always lied, and in the American experiment, that dishonesty was always resisted by a free and robust press and a competing economic marketplace. Every town had multiple newspapers and pamphleteers that forced the refining and exposure of truth that enabled the citizen to hold the powerful to account. They had to compete with each other for readership, advertisers, and for trustworthiness in their reporting in order to be profitable and reputable. The marketplace of the economy was another readout against government corruption. The corporate interests were checked against the needs of the people, and both the market and the government held enough suspicion of each other that it kept both entities relatively honest. I was reminded of a speech by Franklin Roosevelt in his 1936 nominating convention for his second term. It demonstrated the skepticism of government towards the economic royalists and gives some insight into this competitive model of distrust. FDR made the case that the government was the institution worthy of trust because it was formed with the consent of the governed. He laid out a rationale that 90 years on gives tremendous context for some of the reasons that the United States emerged from the Second World War as the exemplary democracy and one that the rest of the world looked to for leadership. He made the case that government can make mistakes, but if the intentions are good, those errors should be held upon different scales than those who are motivated by their own self-preservation and interests. The early 20th century saw the role of government as the defender of the people against the interests of the marketplace. Government believed that they had a responsibility to make certain that the citizen had an equal warrior in their court against the titans of the market. Setting aside any political, philosophical disagreements with that premise, and looking to it purely on the merits of the idea, there is an interesting dynamic that seems to have been posited by FDR and likely is one of the reasons that the institution of government had so much faith placed upon it by the people.
And so in the place of the palace of privilege, we seek to build a temple out of faith and hope and charity. It is a sobering thing, my friends, to be a servant of this great cause. We try in our daily work to remember that the cause belongs not to us, but to the people. The standard is not in the hands of you and me alone. It is carried by America. We seek, all of us I hope, we seek daily to profit from experience, to learn to do better as our task proceeds. Governments can err. Presidents do make mistakes. But the immortal Dante tells us that divine justice weighs the sins of the cold-blooded and the sins of the warm-hearted in different scales. Better the occasional faults of a government that lives in a spirit of charity than the consistent omissions of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference. There is a mysterious cycle in human events. To some generations, much is given. Of other generations, much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny.
Listening to him speak, I find something so contrasting in our modern moment. As America has been more engrossed in endless wars, overwhelming spending, and top-down control over the citizens' speech, thoughts, and actions, it is apparent to me that Dante's scales are no longer applicable to our moment. Governments, as demonstrated by their actions over the last 60 years, have become indistinguishable from the corporations, the media, and the once trusted institutions. Instead of having an advocate in the corner, as FDR might have described, we have all of the American institutions targeting the citizen, who feels defenseless and threatened by powers so outside of their control that fear is the only thing they can grab a hold of. This is not the country that holds claim to any moral high ground any longer. The marketplace has become so large and consolidated that their performance is no longer tied to economic realities. BlackRock and State Street can require advocacy positions instead of profitability, and no matter how many of us want to withhold our monies in our stock purchases to quell their advancement, they are so large and consolidated that there are not enough single stockholders to move the needle beyond their wants. We feel powerless to stop their assault upon the Republic, and their endless consolidation and mergers look more like Mussolini's Italy than it does a free market. Our governments covered up their involvement in the most widespread and egregious abuse of our civil rights since the Civil War. They found ways to hide it from the people and used their power to force Americans into compliance, to leave their ideological bullshit behind, as the diminutive doctor told his friendly audience. They rushed to market a vaccine that has caused untold injuries, but tangible profitability for both the bureaucrat and the business. They colluded with media to make sure that all the questions were silenced and that alternative ideas were marginalized or worse, vilified. To say that we have lost what FDR was claiming government should be is an understatement. We have no bulwark against this amalgamated behemoth. We, the citizens, are under assault by the very institutions that we trusted would be there to defend us in our most vulnerable moment. Dante's scales are loaded up on the side of the cold-blooded, and the warm-hearted servant no longer exists in the government as currently constituted. The media requires the funding of big corporations, and so they are dishonest. They hold neither the government or the marketplace to account. They openly advocate for one outcome, both politically and economically, because they fear a cessation of their existence if they confront either wing of their sustenance. We are alone in this battle as citizens. We have no ability to look for a solution to come from the institutions. We have to work to restore them upon their rightful place of trust. If the citizens are the only warm-hearted people left, we have a heavy task to load the scales up and move the Republic back to a healthy skepticism and an accountability to the dark forces that chose to abandon their posts for the enticement of money and power and a deep freezing of their own blood. I have some hope out there in the world of politics. I see a greater alignment around the ideas instead of personalities, but we have a long way to go. There is significant need to give ourselves the permission to break free of the normal pathways. Their wrestling away of trust means that our traditional responses to their actions will not work. We won't be able to vote our way out of this era of distrust. We are going to need to realign the look of Washington with faces and ideas that coalesce around the principles of the individual. If the government were in an equal competition with media and corporations, we would have a much more robust debate, and elections would once again have consequences. I'm looking for people like Thomas Massie, Rand Paul, Justin Amash, Dennis Kucinich, Robert Kennedy, and others to be the voices and leaders who correct the misalignment of Dante's scales. I don't want to place all my trust or hopes for solutions in government. Far from it. But I do want government to be a competitor to the other institutions so that the truth comes out in the process. We cannot live through another era like the last 4 years, where regardless of party or persona, the government got bigger, the swamp got swampier, the world became more dangerous, and the collusion got much deeper. Voices of debate and guardianship of the individual rights is what Washington should be about, so that perhaps one day we might give the institutions the benefit of the doubt as they pursue noble endeavors rather than the squashing of the individual and the abuse of power that they find so easy to do in their cold-blooded lives.